Stargazing Hill by S.R. Martin. Chapter 5. It was during the night after Heinrich and Kat had left to gather supplies. Once more, as the rope had tried and failed to see the stars that her teacher did. She was tired and frustrated, desperately scanning the pitch-black sky through the big telescope for the tiniest specks of light. Late that night, after fruitless hours of stargazing, she thought she saw something. Not a star, but something in the darkness between the stars, a shifting pattern. She hastened to sketch it down on paper, still staring at it through the telescope. Even though none of it made any rational sense, she got an impression, a feeling. She awoke when Aerika scolded her for falling asleep during an observation. But when she saw the deep rings under her pupil's eyes, her tone softened, and she sent her back into their tent so she could catch some sleep. As the roper returned to the tent, and when she woke in the middle of the next day, she had dismissed her strange observations from the last night as nothing but a dream. But when she returned to her duties and sorted the notes from last night, she found the sketches in her notebook. At first glance, they looked like nothing more than chaotic scribbles, but as she studied them closely, she discovered complex geometric patterns. She started deciphering these patterns into their components, drawing singular forms onto dozens of pages, referencing them against her astrological star charts, until she eventually glimpsed meaning from them. It was a map, laying out the interior of the vast pyramid structure and a clear path to follow through the maze-like corridors. For an astrologer, it was a promise of deeper knowledge, if she could just follow up on this observation. But for this one, instead of turning her gaze to the night sky, she had to look down. When she had deciphered the map, it was already late in the day. She had to hurry if she wanted to follow up on her discovery before her teacher awoke and demanded her assistance for another frustrating night of stargazing. As the roper wandered about the hill until the sun was touching the horizon, finally, she managed to align her maps with the shape of the hill. Following the discovered route, she found an entrance hidden behind tall grass and a thorny bush. Despite her better judgment, the discovery sparked her professional curiosity. She lit up her staff with the spell and went into the tunnel, just to take a brief look. She had to crawl through a narrow gap in the caved-in section of the tunnel until she found the steps downward. When she realized that the interior of the hill was indeed the pyramid, covered by centuries of dust and soil, all plans to quickly return to the surface were forgotten. Her feet quickly carried her downwards, following the revealed route. The wonders she discovered during her descent were manifold. The stonework of the pyramid itself was remarkable, still perfectly preserved in the depth of its interior. Giant slabs of stone, perfectly shaped, fitted together without mortar and only the faintest hairline of a gap where they met, and polished to an almost mirror-like shine. In the corners of each room and along the corridors, torch scones were set into the stone, holding glyph-inscribed star crystals, the same as her astrologer's staff. When she infused one of them with ether, they lit up in a cold white light. Then faint lines of glyphs lit up on the walls, running to all the other crystals, lighting them up as well. Now traveling in faint, cold light, she quickly went deeper, past the altar in this room without much thought, and went deeper still. The chamber below held 6 alcoves in its walls. In them lay warriors, clad from head to toe in dark, glyph-inscribed armor, so she first took them for empty suits. Only when she lifted the visor of one did she discover that the mummified husk of a man lay inside the armor, staring blindly from empty eye sockets. The parchment-like skin, darkened from age, was also finely inscribed with glyphs and clearly mummified in an elaborate process to hold back decay. And deeper she went, faster, more eager, tumbling through the ancient tunnels in a fever-like haze. With each level she climbed down, the complex of tunnels and chambers got ever more vast and sprawling. There were rooms holding rows and rows of ancient weapons, tools, workshops. In the lower levels were mummies wrapped in pristine, white bandages, stacked in alcoves in the walls 3 high in vast complexes of corridors. The glyph-inscribed dark metal chains these mummies wore around their wrists, ankles, and neck suggested them to be slaves, still bound in death to their masters. She remembered there were more warriors as well, an army of them, and some mummies were clad in elaborate robes and wore heavy, golden jewelry. They might have been nobles or a caste of priests. What she still remembered clearly, even through the haze that clouded her memory, was the last chamber she entered. There were no light scones, and the chamber was so vast, the ceiling so high, that for a moment she thought she had stepped outside again and saw the dark, empty night sky of this world. But as she felt her way along the right-handed wall, she felt the engraved glyphs that had run the other chambers of the necropolis. When she infused them with ether, small dots of star crystal, embedded into the walls, began to light up. First a few, then dozens, hundreds, and thousands at once, until the whole domed ceiling shone with tiny dots of light. Asteropa stumbled into the room, gawking upwards. These lights, she realized, showed the stars and constellations that had once lit up the night sky of this world in ancient times, when the builders of this pyramid were at the height of their power. And preserved in them were the collected secrets and magic spells of these people. She stumbled deeper into the room, her eyes wandering, unable to focus on a single constellation at a time. There was so much to take in. What an immeasurable treasure of knowledge she had found. Suddenly she stumbled, and her hands touched something hard and cold as she braced herself from falling. Only now did she lower her eyes to the ground again. She had stumbled upon a stone dais in the middle of the vast room and had braced herself against a dark metal sarcophagus. The lid was forged and carved in high detail, showing the form of a woman dressed in elaborate ceremonial garb, a high crown placed on her fleeting forehead, and all over her cloth, body, or the whole surface of the artifact were the same glyphs and patterns that she had encountered in the rest of the structure. For a moment she marveled and wondered upon the symmetrical, alien yet strangely familiar features of the woman. Asteropa gasped when she noticed the similarity of the wide, squat form with wide shoulders and hips, and the strong-boned face with pronounced brows and fleeting forehead, with the natives they had encountered in their journey to the hill. It was when she wanted to get up that she found herself stuck to the sarcophagus. It was as though someone were holding onto her hand with an iron grip. Panic rose in her, and she struggled to pull herself free when she felt the ether drain from her body into the artifact. Glyphs and patterns lit up one by one, spreading from where she was touching the metal, until the whole sarcophagus was alight with magic energies. Then the eyes of the carving lit up with a cold, ghostly light, and she lost control of her faculties. But she did not faint. Though she only remembered what happened next as one remembers a nightmare, she could still recount some of the events. Something had taken possession of her body. It was old and powerful in the ways of the mind and of magic. It made her body retrace its step all the way to the top of the pyramid. In the room near the top with the 6 warriors, she laid her hand on certain glyphs, spoke a spell in a language only the dead remember, and infused them with power. She did this in all 6 niches, and in each one a cold light awoke in the empty eye sockets of the warrior mummies, and they rose from their eternal slumber. She led these 6 warriors up and outside into their camp, where they quickly overwhelmed anyone who resisted and took them prisoner. They were carried into this very room, and with the wicked, razor-sharp knife, she carved out their hearts one by one, spilling their life essence into the channels and ancient magic mechanisms that ran the pyramid. Once the deed was done, the spirit gave up her body, certainly to return to her own, now awakened form, and the warriors locked the confused and exhausted astrologer up in a cell before escorting the one prisoner she had not been forced to kill out of the chamber, deeper into the complex. Asterope shook her head in despair. And what horrors they have in waiting for my teacher down there, I dare not imagine. While she spoke, Heinrich worked to get her out of the cell. He looped the leather belt he had gotten from one of the dead mercenaries around 2 of the metal bars of the cell, right in the middle where they were weakest. Then, using his short spear as a lever, he twisted the loop so it became ever smaller, eventually pulling the 2 bars together. Even with this clever mechanism, he had to use the whole length of the spear, and eventually Kat's long spear as a lever, as well as her added strength to twist the belt. But turn by turn, the metal bars bent until they touched, widening the gap to the bars to the left and to the right. They repeated the process, left of the bars they had just bent, and eventually, by the time the slim astrologer finished her tale, had created a hole wide enough for her to wriggle through. "You did it!" Kat exclaimed in Heinrich's direction, holding Asterope in her arms so she would not collapse. "Now let's get out of here." "Erika might still be alive. We'll go searching for her," Heinrich said matter-of-factly, collecting his weapons to carry on. Kat looked at him in disbelief. "She was taken by undead warriors in full plate armor. There's no chance," she protested, appealing to his better senses. The white man just shrugged. "Every armor has weakness, and maybe I won't have to fight if Erika is guarded as little as Asterope." He put a reassuring hand on her shoulder and looked her in the eyes, forcing a confident, if slim, smile on his face. "You take her and go back through the portal. Find Leonard and wait for me and Erika to catch up. But no more than an hour. If we make it, we'll be right behind you. If we don't—" He let the last sentence unfinished and turned to head deeper into the necropolis. Kat looked at his back, biting her lip, then at the just freed astrologer, who still hung on to her. They looked at each other for a moment, sharing unspoken questions. Eventually, Asterope gathered herself and stood tall. "Wait! We'll come with you," she called after him, raising her voice just above a whisper. She hurried across the room and picked up her astrologer's staff from a corner in the room where the ghost possessing her had dropped it heedlessly once it had picked up the ceremonial knife. Heinrich stopped in his tracks and looked back over his shoulder. Surprise was written on his face, and he was about to protest when Kat walked over to him and put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Erika has a better chance if we come along," she said. "And you as well," she added under her breath as Asterope caught up with them. The white man sighed. "Would you 2 turn back if I came with you?" Asterope shook her head. "This is all my fault. I have to try to make this right, somehow." Kat grinned with exaggerated bravado. I'm just doing this job for the glory and to pick up women. Yeah, right, Heinrich growled. He wanted to protest. Then he remembered how he had been at their age. He sighed, relented, and pressed forward with careful steps once again, waving for the two young women to follow him. Fools we are, but at least we are fools together, he mumbled, more to himself than to anyone else, remembering the words of a long-dead friend. Chapter 6. They descended the winding stairs even deeper into the necropolis. Though Asteropa had come this way, she had no idea where they had taken her teacher. She just hoped it would not be to the sarcophagus in the star room, for going that deep into the pyramid seemed hopeless even to her. But as luck would have it, dust was on their side. Through the centuries, a thick layer of dust had formed on the floor that now clearly showed footprints. At first, they followed a wide trodden path where the astrologer had gone twice and an armed escort of heavy-booted soldiers had recently passed. The tracks went through the now empty room with the 6 niches and deeper to the next level, where undead slabs were stacked in row upon row of rack-like burial niches. Some of these were now empty, the occupants awoken, serving their masters somewhere deeper in the pyramid. Their naked footprints added to the track, making it even easier to follow, but only until the first tracks started to go their separate ways, the next intersection of tunnels. "Where to now?" Asteropa asked as they stopped. Heinrich crouched down to study the footprints. "That way," he said after short deliberation, pointing right. "How do you know?" Cat asked, squatting beside him, trying to make out what he had seen. "These prints, these narrow, leather-soled shoes, those are Erika's," he explained. "Of course, you remember her feet." Cat jibed as she stood back up. "It's the only leather show track down here. The residents are either barefoot or wear silken slippers or boots," he explained, pointing out the different types of footprints. They continued following the tracks, and passed several more rows of mummified servants. Then the corridor became narrow, and just high enough for Heinrich to stand. After they had taken a few steps down that corridor, the dust on the floor was suddenly gone. "Of all things," Heinrich growled, squatting low, one hand on the floor, trying to make out any tracks at all. Cat squatted down beside him, focusing on the border where the dust ended. The edge ended in thin stripes. "Are they sweeping the floor?" she asked, incredulous. Heinrich just nodded. "What now?" Asteropa asked, looking over their shoulders. "We can still follow the corridor," Heinrich replied, standing back up. "But we'll run into the servants before we can pick up any more tracks." He handed the astrologer his bow, so he had both hands free to use his short spear. "Keep 10 paces behind me," he whispered, and stole into the darkness ahead like a lynx on the prowl. Cat counted her breaths and shifted the grip lower on her spear, then gave Asteropa a nod. They headed down the corridor once more. After 20 steps, they could make out a light, more than just the ever-afterglow in the crystals that lined the corridor. It came from the left corridor at the next intersection. There, 10 steps ahead, one of the star crystals still shone in a pale light. Not brightly, just enough for a servant to see by as she swept the floor. A tall shadow moved in the light, waving for them to catch up. "My bow," Heinrich whispered when they reached him, wedging his short spear into his belt. For a moment, Asteropa stared at him and the corpse at his feet. Clearly, it was one of the servants, gaunt, simply dressed, glyph-inscribed shackles on ankles and wrists. But it was the neck that disturbed her, the neck where a steel collar should have been, or a head for that matter. Instead, the head was laying beside the corpse, once more empty eye sockets facing the wall, and the collar lay between the body and the head.
Bit overkill?
Cat asked, studying the white man's handiwork. He shrugged, taking a step to Asteropa, reaching for his bow, motioning with the sand. Can't be too careful with undead. You never know what keeps them alive, he explained. Asteropa shook herself, then nodded and handed him the bow. Thinking about it rationally, this was not the worst she had seen recently, and the headless servant was now only as dead as it should be by natural order. They crept on, into the darkness beyond the single point of light where the servant had been cleaning. The lights beyond were dark, but the ghostly luminescence was stronger than before, like the ember of a torch that had just blown out. The floor was still clean, but just before they reached the next junction, they heard a voice echoing through the stone corridors.
What is that thing? I assure you it is not necessary,
was Erica's voice, trembling with fear.
I'll gladly answer all your questions. Do you understand me? Prati commerciale tal. Loqueris erudita lingua.
Suddenly, her words cut out with a gasp. The three hurried down the corridor they had heard the voice from, led to a brightly lit room with a stone armchair in the back. A shriveled, mummified woman in a white, elaborate garment that might have been that of a scholar or priest was working on a woman shackled to the chair. It was Erica. A guard in heavy armor stood at attention on the other side of the prisoner. The priestess was securing a helmet-like contraption on the astrologer's head. It was made from black stone, glyph-inscribed metal, and peculiarly cut blue star crystal. Once the crown was secure, the woman touched certain glyphs. The crystals began to glow, and Erica went stiff, her fingers cramping on the stone armrests of the chair. The light from the crystals grew brighter and projected patterns onto the smooth walls, stars and constellations, the master astrologer's memories and secrets drawn out onto the walls in the universal language of astrologers of any culture and any world. Heinrich's first arrow struck the priestess in the side of the neck as he rushed into the room. She turned to face him, her shriveled visage unable to convey shock or anger. She raised a hand to cast a spell, but before she could gather any other, the white man had pumped his machine bow, and a second arrow thumped into her chest, sending her to the ground. Only now did the guard realize what was going on and sprang into action, swinging his sword at Heinrich. It was a heavy, two-handed cleaver that was more useful for intimidation than actual combat, but the undead muscles swung it with the ease and speed of a well-balanced longsword. The white man was forced to step back and barely got his bow up for a desperate parry. With the crack of snapping wood, the bow broke as the blade cut into it, and Heinrich threw the parts against the guard's closed visor to buy himself time, but the guard was unperturbed and raised his blade for a killing blow. Cat lunged past Heinrich, wielding her spear in a powerful thrust. She caught the guard right in the armpit, thwarting his attack, pushing the undead several steps back. She kept pushing, trying to overbalance and drop him to the ground, but the guard slammed into the wall with his back, where she pinned him in place. The bronze spear had not penetrated the dark steel mail that protected the mummy's armpit. He grabbed onto the mercenary's spear, holding it in place, then swung his cleaver down onto the shaft, hacking right through it. Cat stumbled backwards, barely avoiding a backhand swing of the cleaver as the guard regained his footing. Heinrich rushed past her, tackling the guard, throwing him against the back wall again. He grabbed the man's weapon arm with both hands, trying to keep him from swinging his sword. Cat also threw herself at the guard and the two of them wrestled with the undead, trying to keep him from using his long blade, while Heinrich stabbed at the joints of the armor with his short spear. In their struggle, a keychain holding a number of round, bearded keys fell from the guard's belt and hit the floor with a ring. On the other side of the throne, the priest stirred and struggled to her feet. Cold flames burned in her eyes as she grabbed a crystal-tipped scepter where she had leaned it against the wall. She spun and pointed it at Heinrich. The crystal lit up as she infused it with ether. But before she could unleash her spell, the shadows around her began to move and wrapped around her body like tendrils, restraining her, pulling her down. As Steropa had seen the priestess stir, it had immediately begun a silent incantation of a spell of her own, a spell of darkness she had glimpsed in the void between the stars and discovered in the pitch black, wandering the empty corridors of the necropolis. The apprentice astrologer dashed into the room and swiped up the keys, rushed past the three struggling fighters, tried the first key to unshackle her teacher from the terrible device. Cat, Heinrich, and the guard pulled and pushed, turning around one another, caught in a deadly tango. Though they outnumbered the undead soldier and managed to get normally deadly stabs into the weak points of his armor, one even right through the slit of the visor, they could not bring him down. His strength was enormous, and his undead endurance unnatural, unfailing, while they soon gasped for air. Soon the guard whirled them around and threw off Cat. Heinrich still clung to his weapon arm when the undead saw his charge, the priestess bound to the floor, and the young astrologer fiddling with the shackles of the prisoner. With a short, dry punch of his armored glove, he sent the white man to the floor, though Heinrich still clung to the grip of the cleaver. The guard gave up the weapon and rushed over to Asteropa. He grabbed her by the back of her robe and threw her across the room away from the throne. She crashed to the stone floor, rolled, then collapsed in a heap, pressing her left arm against her body with a pained groan. In the back of the room, her spell failed. The shadowy tendrils evaporated and released their prisoner. The guard turned to face his other attackers, and immediately Cat slammed into his midsection, trying to tackle him to the ground. But the undead soldier and his thick plate armor outweighed her several times, and he only took a single step back to regain his balance. He lifted his armored fists above his head and hammered them down on the mercenary's back. The air was battered from her with a grunt. She slumped to the floor like a boneless sack, seeing stars. Heinrich was still on the ground, trying to regain his feet, when the guard lifted his armored boot above Cat's head to crush it like a watermelon. Suddenly, a dart of magic crystal shot from the throne, hitting the guard in the chest. Aerica, still bound to the chair, with the key still in the lock, had managed to wrestle one hand free and used it to cast a desperate spell. There the dart punched through the armor, leaving an egg-sized hole. The guard stumbled backwards, almost fell, but then regained his feet, the gaping wound seemingly no more than an annoyance. He rushed back into the room, once more aiming a kick at Cat's head, who had barely managed to get onto her hands and knees, gasping for air. This time, Heinrich came rushing in, swinging the guard's own cleaver in a wide arc, catching him right under the helmet, where only a chain protected the mummy's neck. But where their bronze spears had failed before, the heavy, dark steel blade struck true, cleaving right through the chain and the man's neck, sending his head flying. The body crashed onto the stone floor like a statue, limbs once again dead and stiff. Behind Heinrich, the priestess had snatched up her scepter and, still on her knees, begun gathering ether for another spell. A bronze spear plunged into her stomach, thwarting her efforts, hastily thrown by Cat, coughing, gasping for air. This time, no warrior was there to protect the spellcaster. Heinrich whirled around and brought the cleaver down on her head in an overhead chop, splitting the skull down to the collarbone, forever extinguishing the ghostly light from the eyes. "Are you all right?" Heinrich asked as he helped Cat back to her feet. She coughed and gasped for air, but nodded and collected what was left of her weapon. Erica pulled the crystal crown from her head and, free from its spell, took a deep breath of relief, before she hastened to grab the key from the open shackle and unlock her other arm.
"Master Roper, are you hurt?"
she asked, still struggling with the lock.
"Just my arm,"
the young woman replied, as Cat and Heinrich helped her stand up. "That looks broken," the white man remarked. "We'll have to set and splint it, but later. Now we have to get out."
"Agreed,"
Erica exclaimed. Finally, the lock snapped open, releasing her other arm. She stood up and looked back at the interrogation device with a shudder. She took up the hateful crystal crown and lifted it up high, then hesitated. For a moment, she recognized the masterful craftsmanship and wondrous magics that were contained within the artifact. But then she remembered the violation she had just suffered from it, grabbed it in both hands, lifted it high above her head, and slammed it down onto the ground, shattering it into pieces. Then she took the scepter from the priestess and nodded to the others to signal that she was more than ready to leave. Heinrich led the way, his hunter's knife returned from spear duty to its sheath, in favor of the heavy cleaver he held in both hands, resting it on his right shoulder, ready to strike anything that might block their escape. Cat went behind him with her spear at their ready, and the two astrologers brought up the rear. Asteropa was pressing her broken arm against her body, but still held her staff in her good hand. While they made their hasty retreat up the levels of the increasingly waking necropolis, Erica spoke to them in agitated whispers.
"Whilst those Ungeheuer try to wring my secrets from me, I in turn managed to glimpse some of theirs. They were once a proud people, ruling over this land with an iron fist. But eventually their slaves rebelled against oppression and blood sacrifice. They had learned secrets of plants and mycelium that hardened their bodies against their master's magic. And their rebellion spread. Through the sacrifice was immense. They tore down the cities and palaces, until only this place remained. Without hope of quelling the rebellion, the queen and the priests enacted a desperate, terrible plan. Through a ritual fueled by their own life, that of every man, woman, and child within the city, they would turn everyone into undead revenants. Then they would slumber in deathly sleep deep within their necropolis, forgotten by the world and by time, till the tribes of the rebelling slaves were no more, and they would once again rise from their graves to reconquer their empire and rule over the world. I guess they didn't plan to sleep until the end of their world, Asteropa remarked between clenched teeth.
Erica shook her head.
Oh, that they did not foresee. They are desperate now. They will do everything to flee this world and conquer ours instead. They'll want to recapture us, to learn of our world and its defenses. That sleeping dogs lie,
Cat cursed. One more reason for us to make haste to the portal, Heinrich said and quickened his steps. They ran into two more unfortunate servants on their way out, but the fall of heavy boots and the clatter of armor behind them urged them to hurry, and they cut them down without hesitation. Passing the shriveled, mutilated bodies, Asteropa prayed that their souls would at least now be free from this eternal servitude. The guards were still in the process of waking up, not organized for this kind of hunt, yet they knew the place better and tried to get ahead of the fleeing prisoners by using parallel corridors. Only a final sprint to the last stairs kept them from being cut off from their way out. When the cold, fresh night air and constant wind hit their faces. The group wanted to stop, to catch their breath. They knew they did not have the time. They had to make it to the Wurd, if they wanted to lose their pursuers. A mile out from the hill, they still noticed no direct pursuit. They only allowed themselves a few minutes of rest and to drink from their last water, while Heinrich sat and bound Asteropa's broken arm with a splint. Then they pressed on, through the tall grass of the steppes, urging their tired legs with every step to take them to the forest. When the first light dawned and they crested a small, grassy hill, they finally spotted their pursuers. Even though they had gained a considerable lead, fresh fear brought new strength to their tired legs, for their pursuers were riding on huge, armor-clad mounts. Four-legged undead beasts, big as houses, carrying tower-like saddles on their back. "We have to get to the forest. The trees will slow them down," Heinrich gasped, discarded the cleaver, and lent a shoulder to help the wounded Asteropa. For half a day they fled over the open steppe, with the beasts hunting them, drawing in ever closer. When the sun stood high in the sky, they finally reached the first trees. By now, their pursuers were close enough to make out details of the riders and their mounts. The beasts had massive heads, covered in the same dark metal glyph-inscribed armor as the warriors. From their mouths protruded thick, curved tusks, reminding Heinrich of the elephants he had seen far in the south, only these tusks were heavily curved and tipped with sharp steel. Leading the charge was a siege tower-like beast, ridden by one of the royal guards, covered in full plate. He held an overlong lance in one hand, so he might skewer his enemies before the beast would trample them into dust. But right behind the vanguard came one rider that was more imposing and terrible than they all, the queen herself, her eyes blazing with cold fury as she rode in a gilded, throne-like saddle, an imposing star-crystal scepter shining in her hand, ready to unleash terrible spells once she got into range. The trees barely slowed the giant beasts down. Heinrich led the group through the thickest parts of the forest, weaving in and out of growth and thick underbush, but they barely managed to stay ahead. Saplings and smaller trees bent and were trampled under the beasts like grass, and even ancient trees only slowed them down a moment before they were uprooted and pushed out of the way. Eventually, Asteropa stumbled and almost pulled Heinrich down with her. The pain of her broken arm had sapped the last of her strength. He tried to pull her up, carry her in his arms, but collapsed after just 2 more steps. Cat came to help them up, but found that she too was at the end of her rope. Baring her teeth against an inescapable fate, she stood over her comrades and presented what was left of her spear. Erika, her hands free, put a hand on her shoulder, then pointed ahead. "Just a bit more. Help me carry her." "What for? We can't even lose them in the woods." Cat gasped in despair. "We won't have to," the astrologer replied. "You'll see." The mercenary did not quite believe her, but the older woman suddenly looked confident, so Cat nodded, and together they helped Heinrich to his feet. The 3 of them carried Asteropa dozens of tortuous steps, beyond exhaustion, while the cracking and breaking of wood just behind them made them turn. The vanguard had finally reached them. The beast broke through the line of trees behind them, its rider lowering his lance for a thrust. One more step the beast took, 2, 3. Cat raised her spear to throw it. Heinrich pulled out his knife, for all the good that would do, and even Asteropa on the ground struggled to raise her crystal staff. When suddenly the lance and the glyph-inscribed dark metal armor of the rider and mount vanished. Without the spells inscribed into the artifacts, nothing bound the souls to the shriveled husks of the mummies, and the dead bodies collapsed like puppets with their strings cut. The queen raised her scepter to signal her men and reined her mount to a stop, then had it walk several steps backwards, away from the invisible boundary between worlds.
Their armor is steel. They cannot pass through the portal,
Cat realized in astonishment.
and without it they are nothing but corpses,
Erica added with a vicious grin. The queen regarded them for a long moment, her eyes smoldering with rage, but as realization of her ultimate defeat set in, the ghostly flames withered. Then she lowered her scepter and turned her mount, leading her band of warriors back to the pyramid, slumping on her throne with hanging shoulders.
"Oh, thank Mortar, that's over,"
Cat sighed, let herself lay down on the ground, too tired to even lift her head. Heinrich nodded at her, slim smile of relief on his weathered face, but after a moment of catching his breath, he straightened his back and tapped Cat on the shoulder. "Let's try to find Leonard and the mules," he said. "We are not out of the Wurd yet." That was Stargazing Hill, written and performed by S.R. Martin. Thank you everyone for listening to my little story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I would appreciate if you could like it and share it around. For now, I bid thee farewell, dreamers, until we shall meet again.